The 18th of April, 1945. Cold wind over the Elbe River, northern Germany. A British intelligence officer named Captain Robert Thornton stood at a checkpoint, his hands trembling, his mind racing with a decision that could end the war early or cost thousands of lives. He had been travelling under German military escort for 3 days. The officer beside him, Major Klaus Steiner, had promised safe passage to neutral Sweden, carrying peace proposals that could prevent the final Soviet assault on Berlin. But when the bridge came into view, something strange happened. No guards waving them through, no clear passage, just the sound of engines in the distance, and Steiner's hand moving slowly toward his sidearm. Robert didn't understand. None of his training had prepared him for this. These were his escorts. Why were they suddenly acting like executioners? That moment would change everything he believed about trust, about loyalty, and about what happens when desperate men make impossible choices. Because on that grey bridge over the Elbe, Germany was fighting its last battle. Not with bullets, but with deception. And what happened next would force Robert to decide whether the man who had saved his life 3 times was about to take it, or sacrifice his own to protect a secret that could change history. Stay till the end to see how one British officer's trust became one of the most dangerous gambles of World War II, and how a German major's final choice would haunt intelligence services for decades. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to support our channel and help us tell more forgotten stories of history that deserve to be remembered. It was the first week of April somewhere over Holland. The sky was grey and thick with smoke. The smell of burning oil and cordite filled the air. Robert Thornton, a 29-year-old British intelligence captain from Kent, had been working behind enemy lines for 6 weeks. His mission was simple on paper. Identify Wehrmacht units willing to negotiate surrender, bypass the Nazi leadership, and shorten the war. When his cover was blown near Bremen, he thought it meant capture or death. The Gestapo had been hunting him for days. He could hear their vehicles in the streets, see their checkpoints on every corner. His contacts had gone silent. His escape routes had closed. He was alone in enemy territory with documents that could get him shot as a spy. But then, something unexpected happened. A Wehrmacht major named Klaus Steiner made contact through an underground network. Steiner claimed to represent German officers who wanted to end the bloodshed, who saw that Hitler's war was lost, and who were willing to risk treason to save what remained of their country. "Meet me at the old brewery," the message said. "Come alone, we can help each other." Robert had grown up hearing that German officers were fanatics, that they would fight to the last man, that surrender was impossible. British intelligence briefings had warned him never to trust Wehrmacht overtures. "They're traps," his handler had said, "always." So when he saw the black Mercedes pull up outside the brewery, his hand went to the cyanide capsule sewn into his collar, not to fight, but to choose his own end. The irony came fast. The German officers who surrounded him didn't shoot. They moved like professionals, checking the street, securing the perimeter, speaking in low voices. Steiner, his uniform pressed and clean despite the chaos, stepped forward and said in perfect English, "Captain Thornton, we don't have much time. The SS are 10 minutes behind you." Robert didn't believe it. Not yet. They placed him in the back seat of the Mercedes. The engine's low rumble mixed with the sound of distant artillery. The smell of leather and tobacco filled the car. Robert stared at his hands, still shaking from adrenaline, and realized the war was no longer something he controlled. It was happening to him now. For the first few hours, suspicion was stronger than relief. He waited for the interrogation that never came. The Germans drove him north, away from the front lines, stopping only at Wehrmacht checkpoints where Steiner's papers cleared them without question. They gave him water, bread, even a cigarette. No handcuffs, no threats, no guns pointed at his head. He heard one of the soldiers whisper, "Is he really British intelligence?" Another replied, "Steiner says he can help end this madness." That night, they stopped at a farmhouse 20 kilometers from Hamburg. A Wehrmacht doctor examined Robert's injuries, minor cuts and exhaustion from weeks on the run, and dressed them carefully. When Robert tried to ask where they were taking him, Steiner said simply, "North, to Sweden. You carry a message we cannot send." The doctor, an older man with tired eyes, brought him hot soup and said in broken English, "The war is ending. Too many have died already." Robert didn't know it then, but that soup, that simple gesture, would become the symbol of everything that confused him about the next 3 days. Outside, trucks rumbled past carrying remnants of broken divisions. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, retreating toward Hamburg and the Baltic coast. By April 1945, more than 4 million German soldiers were being pushed back on all fronts. Many were wounded, starving, leaderless. Few still believed in victory. When Robert was moved to a staff car the next morning, he sat beside Steiner and other officers, who looked less like conquerors and more like pallbearers. One of them said quietly, "We were soldiers. We followed orders. Now we must disobey them to save what's left." At night, he couldn't sleep. The car swayed with each turn. He thought of his wife in London, about the intelligence reports he'd sent, about the mission that had brought him here. He prayed quietly, not for rescue, but for clarity. When they finally approached the Danish border, the countryside stretched flat and green. They were told that under military protocol, Robert would be escorted to neutral territory, carrying proposals for armistice negotiations. British command didn't know about this, neither did Berlin. Robert didn't understand what that meant yet, but he saw desperation where he expected defiance. On the third morning in the car, he looked at Steiner and the other German officers, exhausted, conflicted, dangerous, and realized the war he had been fighting had already changed shape. The enemy before him was not made of ideology anymore. They were men trying to survive the consequences of orders they hadn't chosen. But this was only the beginning. The journey reached the Elbe River on a cold April morning in 1945. The mist was thick and white over the water, and the bridge looked like a ghost suspended in grey air. Robert stood beside the staff car, his coat pulled tight against the wind. Behind him, Steiner and 3 other Wehrmacht officers checked their papers and weapons. Ahead, the bridge stretched empty and silent. Too empty. Too silent. Something was wrong. They had been travelling for 3 days, moving through checkpoints, avoiding SS patrols, sleeping in abandoned buildings. The German officers had been professional, even courteous. Steiner had explained the plan. Cross into Denmark, reach the Swedish border, deliver the armistice proposals to Allied command through neutral channels. Rogue generals, Steiner had called his group, men who see that Berlin is lost and want to stop the slaughter before the Soviets take everything. Robert had started to believe him. The officers shared their rations, translated Danish road signs, even joked quietly about the absurdity of escorting an enemy spy to freedom. One lieutenant, a young man named Fischer, had shown Robert photographs of his family. "I have not seen them in 2 years," Fischer said softly. "I want to go home, before there is no home to return to." But as they approached the bridge, everything changed. Steiner's face went tight. Fischer stopped talking. The driver cut the engine 50 meters from the bridge entrance. "What's wrong?" Robert asked. Steiner didn't answer immediately. He raised binoculars and scanned the far side of the bridge. Then he lowered them slowly and said, "We have a problem." Robert felt ice in his stomach. "What kind of problem?" "SS," Steiner said quietly. "The bridge is being watched." Inside the car, the air grew thick with tension. The smell of sweat and gun oil filled the space. Robert's mind raced. If the SS were there, the mission was over. Worse, if they searched the car and found a British officer travelling under Wehrmacht protection, everyone would be shot as traitors. Steiner turned to him, his grey eyes hard. "Captain Thornton," he said, "you need to decide right now whether you trust me." Robert stared at him. "What are you talking about?" The SS don't know who you are, Steiner said, but they will search us. We can turn back, abandon the mission, and you'll never reach Sweden, or, he paused, glancing at the bridge, or we go forward, and you become my prisoner. The word hung in the air like smoke. Prisoner. Robert's throat went dry. What does that mean? It means we bind your hands, Steiner said. Put you in the back under guard. Tell the SS you're a captured spy being transported for interrogation. They'll let us through. Once we're across, we release you and continue north. Fischer leaned forward, his young face anxious. It's the only way, Herr Hauptmann. If we turn back now, the SS will follow us. They're looking for deserters. Robert looked at each of them. Steiner, calm and calculating. Fischer, desperate and sincere. The driver, silent and tense. Everything in his training screamed trap. Every instinct told him that once his hands were bound, he'd be at their mercy. How do I know you won't just hand me over? Robert asked. Steiner met his eyes. You don't, he said simply. But in 3 days, have I given you reason to doubt? Robert thought about the soup, the bandages, the cigarettes shared in the dark. He thought about Fischer's photographs and Steiner's tired eyes. He thought about the war ending and the choices desperate men make. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said. Do it. Steiner reached into his pack and pulled out a length of rope. As he tied Robert's wrists, not tight but visible, he leaned close and whispered, If anything goes wrong, drop to the floor. We'll handle it. Then they drove toward the bridge. The checkpoint was manned by 6 SS soldiers, black uniforms sharp against the grey mist. Their faces were young but hard, eyes scanning every vehicle with suspicion. As the Mercedes approached, one of them raised his hand. Stop! Steiner rolled down the window. The cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of river water and diesel. An SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain, stepped forward. His uniform was immaculate, his expression cold. Papers, he said in clipped German. Steiner handed over the documents. The SS officer scanned them slowly, his eyes moving from the papers to Steiner's face, then to the car's interior. His gaze landed on Robert in the back seat, hands bound, head down. Who is this? The SS captain asked. British spy, Steiner said calmly. Captured near Bremen. We're transporting him to Flensburg for interrogation by Abwehr. The SS captain's eyes narrowed. Abwehr? They've been dissolved. Everything goes through the SD now. Steiner didn't blink. These are old orders, Herr Hauptsturmführer, signed before the restructuring. We're simply following protocol. The SS officer leaned into the car, staring at Robert. Robert kept his head down, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would give him away. The SS captain said something in rapid German that Robert couldn't follow. Then he switched to English. You. Look at me. Robert raised his head slowly. Their eyes met. The SS officer studied him for a long moment, searching for something. Fear, defiance, lies. What is your rank? The officer asked in English. Captain, Robert said quietly. What unit? I'm not required to tell you that. The SS officer smiled coldly. No, you are not. He straightened and turned back to Steiner. For a moment, Robert thought it was over. They'd be arrested, shot, thrown into the river. But then the SS officer handed back the papers. The bridge is closed, he said. Reichsführer's orders. No military traffic without SS authorization. Steiner's jaw tightened. We have Wehrmacht authorization from... I don't care, the SS officer interrupted. This bridge is under SS control now. Turn around. There was a long silence. Robert could feel the tension radiating from Steiner, from Fischer, from every man in the car. Finally, Steiner said, Understood, Herr Hauptsturmführer. We'll find another route. He put the car in reverse. Slowly, they backed away from the checkpoint. The SS soldiers watched them go, rifles ready, eyes suspicious. When they were out of sight of the bridge, Steiner pulled off the road into a cluster of trees. He cut the engine and sat still for a moment, hands gripping the wheel. Then he turned to Robert and untied the ropes. "Well," Steiner said quietly, "that didn't work." Robert rubbed his wrists, his mind racing. "What now?" Fisher spoke up from the front seat. "There's another bridge, 20 kilometers east, smaller, maybe less guarded." "Or more," another officer said grimly. "The SS are everywhere now. They're shooting deserters on sight." Steiner looked at Robert. "We have a choice, Captain. We can try the other bridge and risk the same problem. Or—" He paused. "Or we cross here," Steiner said. "Tonight, without permission." Robert stared at him. "You mean sneak across? Through an SS checkpoint?" "Not through," Steiner said. "Around. There's a railway bridge half a kilometer downstream, damaged by bombing but still standing. We can cross on foot, leave the car, and continue on the other side." Fisher shook his head. "Herr Major, if we're caught—" "We won't be caught," Steiner said firmly. "Not if we move at night." He looked at Robert again. "But I need to know you're willing to take the risk. If we're discovered, the SS will execute all of us, including you." Robert felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every choice he'd made in the past 3 days had brought him here, to this moment, to this impossible gamble. He thought about the mission, about ending the war, about the thousands of lives that could be saved if the armistice proposals reached Allied command. He thought about Steiner's tired eyes and Fisher's photographs. He thought about trust. "All right," Robert said. "We cross tonight." Steiner nodded. "Then we wait for dark. And we pray the bridge holds." But Robert didn't know yet that Steiner was hiding something. Something that would turn everything he believed upside down. Something that would make him question whether the past 3 days had been an escape or the most elaborate trap in the history of the war. The night came cold and black. No moon. Only stars, scattered like broken glass across the sky. The smell of wet earth and river water filled the air. Robert crouched beside Steiner and the others at the edge of the tree line, watching the railway bridge in the distance. It was a skeleton of twisted metal and concrete, half collapsed from Allied bombing, stretching across the dark water like a broken spine. The SS checkpoint was visible upstream, faint lights and the occasional sound of voices carrying on the wind. Steiner whispered, "We go in pairs. Fisher and I first, you and Muller second. Stay low, move fast, no talking." Robert nodded, his heart hammered against his ribs. Muller, the driver, checked his pistol and gave Robert a grim look. "Stay close to me, Englishman. If something happens, we run back. Verstehen?" "Understood," Robert whispered. Steiner and Fisher moved first, shadows slipping through the grass toward the riverbank. Robert watched them disappear into the darkness, his breath misting in the cold air. Minutes passed like hours. Then Steiner's hand signal. "Come." Robert and Muller followed, boots crunching softly on gravel, bodies bent low. The sound of the river grew louder, water rushing over rocks and debris. When they reached the bridge approach, Robert looked up at the damaged structure. Sections of rail were missing. Support beams hung at odd angles. The walkway was barely a meter wide in places. "This is insane," Robert whispered. "Yes," Steiner said. "It is, but it's the only way." They started across. The bridge swayed with every step. The metal groaned under their weight, and the river below sounded like a living thing, hungry and cold. Robert kept his eyes forward, focusing on Steiner's back, not looking down. Halfway across, Fisher froze. "Halt!" he hissed. Everyone stopped. In the distance, voices, German voices, coming from the far side of the bridge. Robert's stomach dropped. Steiner raised his hand, signaling silence. They crouched in the shadows of a broken support beam, barely breathing. The voices grew louder. 2 SS soldiers appeared on the far bank, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were patrolling the railway line, checking for deserters or saboteurs. Robert pressed himself against the cold metal, feeling every muscle in his body tense. If the flashlights swept across the bridge, they'd be seen. If the soldiers decided to check the structure, they'd be caught. Steiner's hand moved slowly to his sidearm. Fischer did the same. They were preparing to fight. Robert realized with cold certainty that if shooting started, none of them would survive. The bridge was a trap. No cover, no escape, just open metal and river below. But then something strange happened. One of the SS soldiers laughed. The other said something Robert couldn't hear. And slowly the voices faded. The flashlights moved away. They were leaving. Steiner waited a full minute before moving again. Then he motioned forward. They crossed the rest of the bridge in silence, every step measured, every breath controlled. When they finally reached solid ground on the far side, Robert felt his legs nearly give out from relief. They had made it. They had crossed the Elbe. They were... Suddenly, lights blazed from the trees. Spotlights, blinding and white, illuminating the entire area like daylight. Robert threw up his hand to shield his eyes. Voices shouted in German. Halt! Hände hoch! Hands up. Robert's blood turned to ice. They were surrounded. Figures emerged from the darkness, at least a dozen men in Wehrmacht uniforms. Weapons raised. Steiner didn't move. Fischer dropped his pistol. Müller raised his hands slowly. Robert stood frozen, his mind screaming, "Trap, trap!" This was always a trap. A figure stepped forward into the light. An older officer, a colonel by his insignia, grey-haired and stern-faced. He looked at Steiner and said in sharp German, "Major Steiner, you're late." Steiner straightened to attention. "Yes, Herr Oberst. We encountered complications." The colonel's eyes moved to Robert. "And this is the British intelligence officer?" "Yes, sir." Robert's mind reeled. Steiner knew this man. This had been planned. All of it. The journey, the delays, the bridge. His voice came out hoarse. "What is this?" The colonel smiled coldly. "This, Captain Thornton, is the end of your mission." He nodded to his men. "Secure them. All of them." Soldiers moved forward, grabbing Robert's arms, forcing him to his knees. He looked at Steiner, betrayal and fury burning in his chest. "You lied," Robert said. "You said—" "I said I would get you across the Elbe," Steiner interrupted quietly. "I did." "To hand me over to—" "No," the colonel said, stepping closer. "Not to hand you over. To force a choice." He knelt down so his face was level with Robert's. "You see, Captain, there are some of us in the Wehrmacht who understand that this war is lost. But there are others who believe we can still negotiate from strength, and those men need leverage." Robert's stomach twisted. "Leverage? You carry peace proposals," the colonel said. "Documents that prove German officers are willing to surrender. That makes you valuable, to us and to the SS hunting us." The colonel stood. "So here is your choice, Captain Thornton. You can continue north with these documents and deliver them to Allied command, knowing that doing so will expose everyone involved and trigger SS reprisals that will kill thousands. Or," he paused, "you can destroy the documents, here, now. And I will personally escort you to Sweden as a regular prisoner exchange, no intelligence value, no political complications, no bloodbath." Robert stared at him, his mind spinning. "You're asking me to sabotage my own mission?" "I'm asking you to save lives," the colonel said, "including your own." Steiner spoke quietly. "He's telling the truth, Captain. If those documents reach Allied command, the SS will hunt down every officer involved. Not just us, our families, anyone connected. The reprisals will be brutal." Fischer added, "My wife, my children, they're in Hamburg. If my name appears on those papers—" Robert looked at each of them. The German officers who had saved him, escorted him, protected him, and now were asking him to betray everything he'd worked for. The colonel drew his pistol and held it loosely at his side. "I need your answer, Captain, now." Robert's hands shook. He thought about the mission, about ending the war, about the orders he'd followed. He thought about Fischer's family and Steiner's tired eyes. He thought about what kind of man chooses mission over mercy, and then he made his choice. The silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like hours. Robert looked at the colonel, at Steiner, at the soldiers surrounding them. Finally he said, "No." The colonel's expression hardened. "No?" "I won't destroy the documents," Robert said, his voice steadier than he felt. "These proposals could save thousands of lives, maybe tens of thousands. I'm not going to let fear of reprisals stop that." Steiner closed his eyes. Fischer made a sound, like a man who'd been punched. The colonel stared at Robert for a long moment. Then he raised his pistol. "Then I'm sorry, Captain, but I cannot let you continue." Robert's breath caught. This was it. After 3 days of trust, of hope, of believing in something impossible, it ended here, with a German bullet in a dark forest. But he wouldn't close his eyes. He wouldn't look away. If they were going to execute him, they'd have to see his face when they did it. The colonel's finger moved to the trigger, and then Steiner spoke. "Wait!" The colonel turned. "Major?" "He's right," Steiner said quietly. "The documents are more important than our safety." The colonel's voice went cold. "Major Steiner, that is not your decision to make." "No," Steiner agreed, "but it's the right decision anyway." He looked at Fischer, at Müller, at the other officers. "We became soldiers to protect Germany, not to save ourselves while thousands more die, men. If these proposals can end the war early, then we have a duty to ensure they reach Allied command, even if it costs us everything." Fischer hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He's right, Herr Oberst." Müller said, "I agree." The colonel's jaw tightened. For a moment, Robert thought he would shoot them all. But then, slowly, the colonel lowered his pistol. "You're all fools," he said quietly. "And you'll all die for this." "Perhaps," Steiner said. "But we'll die as soldiers, not cowards." The colonel studied them for a long moment. Then he turned to his men. "Release them." The soldiers hesitated, then stepped back. Robert stood on shaking legs. The colonel looked at him with something like respect. "You have courage, Captain Thornton. I hope it doesn't get you killed." He nodded to Steiner. "You have 6 hours before I report this encounter. Use them wisely." Then he and his men disappeared back into the trees, leaving only darkness and the sound of the river. Robert turned to Steiner. "You didn't know he'd be here, did you?" Steiner shook his head. "No. Someone betrayed us. Someone told him about the crossing. But you defended me anyway." "I gave you my word," Steiner said simply. "That still means something." They walked north through the night, exhausted and cold. 3 days later, they reached the Swedish border. Robert crossed with the documents intact. Steiner and his men turned back, knowing what awaited them. The journey home began on a grey morning in May. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. The documents Robert carried had reached Allied command, and while they hadn't ended the war early, they had exposed Wehrmacht officers willing to defy the Nazi regime. Some of those officers had survived, many had not. Robert stood at the Swedish port, waiting for a British transport ship. The Baltic stretched cold and endless. Behind him, Sweden's neutrality had given him safety. Ahead, England and whatever awaited him there. The voyage across the North Sea took days. The sea was calm, but Robert's thoughts were not. He thought about Steiner, about Fischer's family, about the German colonel who had let them go. He wondered how many had died because of the choice he'd made, how many families had paid the price for his integrity. When the ship finally reached England, the scene was jubilant. The docks were crowded with celebrating civilians, victory banners, music and cheering. People shouted, "The war is over!" But as Robert walked down the gangway, his boots heavy on British soil, he felt hollow. At the debriefing centre, intelligence officers checked his papers. One man looked at his mission report and frowned. "You travelled under German escort for 3 days?" "Yes, sir." "And they didn't harm you?" "No, sir. They protected me." The officer made a note. "That's unusual." "Yes, sir. It was. When Robert was finally released, he took a train to Kent. The countryside looked green and untouched, as if the war had never happened here. But he knew better. Every village had its memorials, its missing sons, its grieving families. He found his wife, Elizabeth, in their cottage. When they embraced, she wept. "I thought you were dead," she said. "The report said you'd gone missing." "I was," Robert said, "but someone found me." That night, she asked him about the mission, about Germany, about how he'd survived. Robert tried to explain. The escort, the trust, the bridge, the choice. But every time he mentioned the Germans by name, she looked uncomfortable. "They were still the enemy," she said quietly. "No matter what they did." Robert nodded, but he couldn't make her understand that the line between enemy and ally was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. In the weeks that followed, he reported to military intelligence headquarters in London. Officers asked detailed questions about Steiner, about the Wehrmacht network, about the officers who had helped him. When Robert mentioned that many of them would face SS reprisals, one officer said, "That's unfortunate, but they made their choice." Robert thought about that phrase for a long time. They made their choice, just as he had made his. By 1947, Robert found work as a liaison officer for the Allied occupation government. His job was to interview German military personnel, assess their wartime activities, identify those responsible for crimes. Every day, he sat between two worlds: British victors seeking accountability and German soldiers waiting for judgment. One afternoon during an interview, a file crossed his desk. Major Klaus Steiner, Wehrmacht intelligence officer, wanted for questioning regarding unauthorized contact with enemy personnel. Robert stared at the photograph. It was him, older, thinner, but unmistakably the man who had escorted him to Sweden. The report said Steiner had been arrested by the Soviets in June 1945. No further information. Robert closed the file slowly. He never reported that he had known Steiner personally, never testified about what had happened at the bridge. Some truths, he had learned, were too complicated for official records. Sometimes he visited the Thames, watching the water flow past London's ruins. The city was slowly rebuilding. New buildings rose where bombs had fallen. Children played in parks that had been shelters. The scars of war were healing, but not the memories. One evening, a young army officer approached him. "Sir, I heard you worked behind enemy lines. What was it like?" Robert thought for a moment. "Confusing," he finally said. "The enemy wasn't always who you expected." The officer looked puzzled, but didn't ask further. By the early 1950s, Britain had moved on. The war became history, stories told in schools, commemorations held each November. But Robert carried something that couldn't be commemorated. The knowledge that the man who had saved his life had probably died in a Soviet prison. That Fisher's family might have been killed in reprisals, that his choice to complete the mission had cost people who trusted him everything. He kept no diary, wrote no memoir. Some stories were too dangerous to tell. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would think about the bridge. About the moment Steiner had defended him to the colonel. About the choice between mission and mercy. And he wondered if he had chosen correctly. Years later, when Robert was older and grey, he received a letter from Germany. No return address, just a postmark from Hamburg. Inside was a single photograph. A young woman with 2 children smiling in front of a rebuilt house. On the back, written in faded ink, "They survived. Thank you. F." Fisher. Somehow, Fisher had survived. His family had survived. Robert stood there for a long time, holding the photograph, tears running down his face. Maybe the choice had been right after all. Maybe trust, even when it seemed impossible, could save more than it cost. Or maybe he would never really know. As he walked out into the London afternoon, the sun breaking through clouds, he thought about all the young men who would never understand the lesson he'd learned. That the enemy can teach you more about honor than your own side ever could. That sometimes the person trying to kill you is actually trying to save you from yourself. That the hardest battles are never fought with weapons, but with the choice to believe in someone when everything tells you not to. The war had taken everything from him. His certainty, his simple view of right and wrong, his belief that uniforms defined loyalty, but it had given him something more valuable. The understanding that courage is not always about completing the mission. Sometimes courage is knowing when to trust the enemy. Sometimes strength is accepting that the people who saved you might die because of the choice you made. And sometimes the greatest act of faith is believing that even in war, even in darkness, even when every instinct screams otherwise, humanity can survive. Robert kept that photograph for the rest of his life. He never showed it to anyone, never explained where it came from. It stayed in his desk drawer, a secret testament to a night at a bridge where German officers chose honor over safety and a British captain chose mission over mercy. And somewhere in Germany, in a rebuilt house in Hamburg, a family lived because men had made impossible choices in the darkness. Because trust had survived when hate should have won. Because sometimes, in the end, the enemy becomes the only one who truly understands what you sacrificed. The bridge still stands today, rebuilt and modernized. Trains cross it every hour. People walk across without knowing its history. But Robert knew. And on the day he died, at the age of 82, his last words were in German. Danke, mein Freund. Thank you, my friend. For a man he had trusted. For a German who had kept his word. For a soldier who proved that even in the depths of war, even at the very end, even when everything was lost, some promises could still be kept. And that sometimes the greatest betrayal is not breaking faith with the enemy. It's breaking faith with yourself.